11 of the fantasy football season, and here's a few wide receivers I will bench this week. The first guy, Mike Williams of the Los Angeles Chargers. So Mike Williams, he got off to a monster start the first 4 weeks of the season. But ever since then, besides that Week 5 game where he had a huge fantasy day, he's definitely tiered it off here from Week 6 on. Week 6 at Baltimore, 2 catches, 27 yards. Week 8 versus the Patriots, 2 catches, 19 yards. Week 9 at Philly, 2 catches, 58 yards. And Week 10 versus Minnesota, 4 catches, 33 yards. So right here, another pretty tough matchup versus the Pittsburgh Steelers that are middle in the pack versus wide receivers, giving up the 16th least amount of fantasy points this year right here. And right now, Mike Williams, he hasn't contributed to fantasy owners, like I mentioned, since Week 5. And there's no way I would trust him, especially in basic format leagues with 2 wide receivers in a flex. He's an easy bench in my opinion. Can I see him have a good game and break out? Yeah, definitely, but there's no way I could trust him after what we've seen from him over the last month. So right here, Keenan Allen's getting more targets in that Charger offense, it seems like, over the last few weeks. Austin Eckler still running the football pretty well. He's had a couple down games. And Justin Herbert, he's taking a lot of runs for himself and finding Cook and Parham. So right now, he's just not targeting Mike Williams a lot like he did early in the season. And a lot of teams, they're just trying to take that deep ball away from Mike Williams because he's kind of a one-trick pony as a deep threat. So right here, he hasn't done much the last few weeks, and he's an easy wide receiver to bench this week. The next wide receiver, I will bench Chase Claypool of the Pittsburgh Steelers. So Chase Claypool, he was banged up and out in Week 10's ball game with the toe injury. And even if he returns here in Week 11, is Claypool versus the Los Angeles Chargers. It's definitely a tough matchup. And Claypool, another guy who's been a big disappointment, in my opinion, this year for fantasy football. The last few weeks for him, he's been non-existent pretty much. Week 6 versus Seattle, 2 catches, 17 yards. Week 8 at Cleveland, 4 catches, 45 yards, 2 rushes for 15 yards. And Week 9 versus Chicago, 2 carries, he had 13 rushing yards and 3 catches for 30 yards. So right here, I thought it'd be a big season for Claypool like it was last year in his rookie year. And then to add on top of it, Juju Smith-Schuster's been out since the earlier part of the year. But right now, he's not getting anything going. He's only really had 2 great fantasy days this season. And now he's got a tough matchup if he plays in this one at the Los Angeles Chargers that give up the second least amount of fantasy points to wide receivers on the season. So with his struggles, with his injuries, and with him just not seeing targets, he's an easy wide receiver to get away from this week and put on your bench. The next wide receiver is Allen Robinson of the Chicago Bears. So Allen Robinson, another player who's been a total bust this season in fantasy football. He went second or third round of most fantasy drafts this year. And him and Justin Fields, they just can't get on the same page for whatever reason this year. So the last few games here for Robinson, Week 6 versus Green Bay, 4 catches, 53 yards. Week 7 at Tampa, 2 catches, 16 yards. Week 8 versus the Niners, 3 catches, 21 yards. And Week 9 at the Pittsburgh Steelers, 4 catches, 68 yards. So that's not going to get the job done here for Allen Robinson. And he was on bye last week in Week 10. But they got a tough matchup as well versus the Baltimore Ravens that give up the 7th least amount of fantasy points to wide receivers on the season. So the numbers haven't been there. The targets really haven't been there. And teams have shut down Robinson and made other players try to beat him. And this week, I would bench him once again with a tough matchup and the bad stats this season. The next wide receiver, Tyler Boyd of the Cincinnati Bengals. So Tyler Boyd, another player who just hasn't produced this season. And he's taken a backseat to Jamar Chase, obviously, and T. Higgins, and even C.J. Uzomah, it seems like, in this offense over there. So Joe Burrow has tons of weapons over there in Cincinnati. Tyler Boyd's only had good games when T. Higgins was out of the lineup early in the season. He had one good game in Week 8 at the Jets, but the last few weeks for him, Week 6 at Detroit, 1 catch, 7 yards. Week 7 at Baltimore, 4 catches, 39 yards. Week 8 at the Jets, 5 catches, 69 yards and a touchdown. And he also added 46 yards passing. And Week 9 versus Cleveland, 1 catch for 11 yards. So right now, Tyler Boyd, he's pretty much not factored into the offense, in my opinion. And he's more of a third wide receiver that's not going to be in there much. And Joe Burrow, he loves targeting Jamar Chase, it's obvious. T. Higgins, we know he's a great playmaker. We saw it last season, and we've seen flashes this year. And right here, it's a tough matchup on paper at the Vegas Raiders that give up the 5th least amount of fantasy points to wide receivers on the season. So with his inconsistencies and him not getting targets, and somehow still owned as well in 67% of fantasy leagues. He's an easy guy to bench this week here, is Tyler Boyd, and the fifth and final wide receiver I will bench this week's Kenny Golladay of the New York Giants. Kenny Golladay, it looks like he's going to come back here after in Week 9 he returned, and he didn't get injured in practice or anything during the Week 10 bye. So the last few games here, Week 4 at New Orleans, 6 catches, 116 yards. And then Week 9 versus the Raiders, he didn't do anything though. 2 catches, 28 yards, but he seems healthy coming into this week for Monday Night Football. But right here, he's a guy that could go down at any time as well as Golladay. We know he was great a few seasons ago with Matthew Stafford in this Detroit Lion offense, but he hasn't been the same in the last 3 years here. Last season, he missed a lot of ball games with injury in the hamstring. And this year, he's been injury-riddled since training camp here as Golladay. So on paper, it's a good matchup at Tampa Bay that gives up the 10th most fantasy points to wide receivers on the season. But right here, he's just not getting the job done. And he's always injured as Golladay. So he's a wide receiver I could get away from this week and bench. So that's a few wide receivers I would bench here in Week 11 of the fantasy football season.